Hi, I'm Rhys Coleman, Waterways and Wetlands Research Manager at Melbourne Water, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Melbourne Streams. It's a series of seminars that we're running over 2 to 3 weeks during the COVID stage 4 restrictions, and we're running them in particular with the Waterways and Land crews in mind. The topics that we'll be presenting have been voted on by the crews, and they come out of research projects that Melbourne Water has been investing in over recent years. Yesterday, you would have heard a presentation from Dr. Kathy Russell from the Melbourne Waterway Research to Practice Partnership between Melbourne Water and the University of Melbourne. And Kathy's talk was on physical form of streams and what that means for waterway management. Today, I'm really pleased to bring you a talk from Dr. Sacha Jellinek, also of the Melbourne Waterway Research to Practice Partnership with the University of Melbourne. But Sacha, who recently joined us, is also half-time at Melbourne Water as well. So he has an interesting role there. So Sacha is an ecologist with an interest in habitat restoration at the landscape scale, and in particular, the prioritisation of management actions for biodiversity. And that includes under a changing climate, which leads into his talk today, which is about adjusting to climate change, impacts on native vegetation and wetlands. So prior to working with us in the partnership and at Melbourne Water, Sacha's worked for Greening Australia, and he's also worked with La Trobe University and the Arthur Rylah Institute. In Sacha's talk, he'll provide an overview of climate change projections for the Melbourne region and describe what that means for vegetation, in particular revegetation of waterways. He'll also talk about existing guidelines that would help support organisations like Melbourne Water with climate resilient revegetation practices. So there's some really good references in there that he provides more details at the end of his talk. So we do currently have revegetation guidelines within Melbourne Water, and we definitely acknowledge that we need to be doing more in this space, thinking about what does climate change mean for our revegetation programs. So planting a tree today, it could very much be living in a very different climate in 10, 50, 100 years' time. So we really must be thinking about climate change in terms of our revegetation activities. And we are doing things in this space, but it's also fair to say that we should acknowledge the challenges, such as, where do we get suitable stock from? How do we source suitable seed? How do we get suitable tube stock that is climate resilient and covers all the bases, like Sacha will talk about? Fortunately, we have Paul Rees and Matilda Manning of Melbourne Water leading that charge and thinking about what that means for us and what we can put in place in the interim. And then as the research emerges, how do we provide a continuous improvement approach to what we're doing? So we hope you enjoy this presentation. It'll go for about half an hour, like the one did yesterday. If you have any technical questions, then Sacha kindly provides his email at the end. So feel free to contact Sacha directly via his email. Or if you have any questions more broadly about the Waterways and Wetlands Research Program, then feel free to contact myself, rhys.coleman@melbournewater.com.au, or slobodanka.stojkovic@melbournewater.com.au, who's also in the Waterways and Wetlands Research team, and we can help you more broadly with questions you might have. Anyway, we hope you enjoy this presentation today, and we look forward to providing more topics over the days to come. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Sacha Jellinek, and I'm here today to talk to you about adjusting to a changing climate and how we can better make our native vegetation and wetlands resilient to a changing climate. I'm from the Waterway Ecosystem Research Group at the University of Melbourne, and I'm also based at Melbourne Water. So today we're going to talk about what climate change will look like and how it will affect Melbourne and around Victoria. We're going to talk about climate future plots and why they're important. We're also going to talk about what are the different aims of climate future plots. How can we make more climate resilient revegetation in cleared and fragmented landscapes? How can we introduce new plant genetics to enhance the resilience of existing natural systems, such as national parks? How can we produce climate-ready seed from things like seed production areas? And how can we establish research plots so we can better adapt and learn from what we're doing in the field? Then I'll talk about how to choose the correct species and the correct provenances when undertaking revegetation based on our climate analogues, and how to monitor and manage revegetation data so we can, again, adapt and learn to what we're doing in the future. And then I'll summarise. So there's been recently a number of projections which have been done by CSIRO in conjunction with the department, and these projections are called VCP19, and they simulate the response of the climate systems to a range of different scenarios. And you can see in this graph below that up until the mid-1980s to 1990, the climate was remaining relatively similar, and past that point has started to rise. And there's been a number of projections done since that time to see what the likely trend of that climate projection will be. And the red dashed line is that projection, and the red wavy line is how the current temperature is tracking to that projection. And you can see that it's pretty accurate at the moment, that at the moment the projection and the way the climate is tracking are pretty well the same. And we can also see that there's a number of different, what we're calling representative concentration pathways, or how the greenhouse gas emissions affects our emission scenarios. And the ones we're mostly talking about today are RCP 8.5, which is basically the worst case scenario, where we keep emitting how we are at present, or RCP 4.5, where there's a reduction in emissions. So we're mostly talking today about the blue line and the red line. So there's been a number of different climate models, up to 40, and they produce different projections. But overall, a lot of the mapping you see is taking into consideration all of these different projections. So as I said, there's 40 global climate models running, and for the CSIRO modelling, which was recently done, they use 6 models out of these 40. And you can see from this graph that the red line is, again, the worst case scenario. So the projections are fairly accurate up until 2100, and after that point, they're probably, we're not so sure what the projections are likely to be. But we're fairly certain up to 2100 that if we keep emitting the way we do, then there'll be a 4-degree or higher change in temperature. Whereas if we reduce our emissions, so the light blue line, RCP 4.5, you can see that the emissions will stabilise at around 2 degrees above current temperatures. So it's really important that we understand how the climate might change, and also how that will affect the plants and animals that we're trying to preserve, as well as the human population. So summer maximum temperatures are likely to change in Melbourne from about 1 degree up to 3.2 degrees Celsius. And you can see across the state that these projections are fairly similar. So this is going to 2050, and the projections for 2070 are again higher. So we're looking at about a 3.2 degree temperature rise at the moment for Melbourne by 2050. As far as rainfall concerned, we might look at between -2 to -16% decline in rainfall in Melbourne, and again across the state that varies a bit more. So you can see around the Wodonga area you might get up to -26% decline in rainfall over winter, and up around Hamilton area you might get -19% decline in rainfall. So again, this is to 2050, and the projections to 2070 are higher lack of rainfall in winter as well. But overall, we're expected to see a hotter and drier climate in the future. So these are the projections for Greater Melbourne. So you can see that temperature change is likely by about 2050 to be 1 to 2 degrees, and by 2090 it's likely to be 4 degrees or higher with under a high emission scenario. For rainfall, we're looking at more around 2050, a decline in about, as I said, 15% rainfall, and up to 2090 it might be up to 20% decline in rainfall. And overall, we're looking at a lot more hot days. So we're talking, when we say hot days, we mean above 35 degrees Celsius. And they're approximately going to double by 2050, the amount of hot days that we get. We're also likely to see less rainfall, especially over winter and spring, and more extreme or heavy rainfall events. Frost will become less frequent over time, and there'll be an increase in fire danger days around Melbourne by about 42%. And climate change is going to have a huge impact on plants as well. So it's expected to influence flowering, pollination, how seeds are dispersed, seed production and the viability of seeds. It's likely to affect how plants are able to germinate and recruit. So if you expect lower frosts, then things like sweet Bosseria or Bosseria spinosa may not be able to germinate in some areas. So you may lose some species due to a lack of germination. Also, if we're expecting lower rainfall in winter and spring, that's likely to have a huge influence on when we undertake revegetation, the success of that revegetation. Also, if we're looking at adult plant survival, we know that a lot of these populations are even currently being impacted by extreme events, such as the number of hot days or extreme rainfall events. So climate change is likely to have a huge impact on the vegetation communities that we currently have, and also how we restore vegetation communities in the future. And we may not see an overall decline in species. Some species may do better and some will do worse. And this is likely to influence the different plant species in the EVCs that we see at the moment. And we don't really know a whole lot about plant life cycles for a lot of species. So doing this work gives us an ability to build up on knowledge about species and how they're likely to survive through time. So where are things like climate-adjusted plantings being undertaken at the moment? Well, they've started in both Victoria and throughout Australia, and there's been a number of guides produced, firstly by DELP and Greening Australia, to help community groups undertake revegetation in Victoria. And also the CSIRO are putting out guidelines on a nationwide restoration research project called PERI. So that's really about setting up a number of different research sites to get a better idea about how restoration and indeed climate change is likely to affect our plant species. So when we talk about climate future plots, what do we actually mean? Well, they're areas of revegetated or restored land which incorporate the genetic and or species diversity to help enhance a habitat resilience to a changing climate. And we really want to be careful about the species we select, and especially the provenances. And when we say provenances, we mean the seeds sourced from different geographical locations, because it's going to really help these plant communities survive into the future. And we want to maintain the genetic diversity and also increase the adaptive potential of these plantings under a changing climate. And plots can contain a mix of local and climate adapted seed and plant genotypes, such as seed from hotter and drier climates. And our choice of provenances is really important. This is blue gum in 2 populations in Tasmania. And you can see that they have very different life forms, even though they're exactly the same species. So the same species is likely to vary widely, and the differences are often genetic, and they're able to adapt to different environments using these genetics. So it's really important that we have an understanding of plant genetics and how that's likely to influence the areas that we're trying to restore. And in the past, the paradigm was that local is best. Well, we're starting to rethink that now. So we used to think that local was best because it allowed us to maintain the current pattern of genetic variation, and it would avoid problems such as poorly adapted seed or seedlings to the local environment, and also genetic contamination of local populations and outbreeding depression. However, the landscape's changed a lot, and there's been increasing fragmentation, and we've seen a loss of genetic diversity in local populations. And also the environment has altered, so nutrient and soil communities have altered largely due to things like agriculture. So the landscape's changed, and so we've got to help these plant communities adapt with it. So where are the local species likely to survive in the future? Well, if we're looking at ironbark, for example, we can see that modelling shows that this species is really closely aligned to aridity, and aridity is a major factor that's associated where this provenance adapts to. So we can see that at present, ironbark is found right across parts of Victoria, with the red areas showing arid adapted plant genotypes and the bluer areas showing wet adapted ones. But up to 2070, these arid areas are likely to move, these arid areas are likely to increase. So it may be outside the current range of this species to be maintained there. So they're going to have to move to different locations. And in fact, we may not be able to restore these species outside of their current range. So restoration plantings may benefit if we assist the migration of genetic material by supplementing local seed adapted to hotter and drier climates. So this is what we mean by climate adjusted provenancing. And there's a number of different steps to helping us adapt species to a changing climate. So here we're going to talk about 7 steps that might help organisations and community groups and organisations such as Melbourne Water to plan, establish and monitor climate future plots. So first we want to define why we're planting the area. What's our goal for it? And that's really important. So do we want to revegetate cleared and fragmented landscapes? Do we want to try and introduce new plant genetics to enhance the resilience of existing natural landscapes, such as national parks? Do we want to produce seed from different plant genetics so we can undertake broad-scale revegetation using the seed in the future? Do we want to establish research plots to help us assess how plants survive and grow and reproduce? And do we want to, and we need to understand how the climate projections for our local area are likely to change our plant populations. So depending on where you are in Victoria, it's likely to influence how much rainfall and what the temperature change is going to be. And there's also other factors to think about. As I said before, there's likely to be fewer frosts. Sea level rise may flood some current wetland areas. And we may also see a drying of the environment. So wetlands that are currently fresh may turn saline or may in fact dry out over time. So there's a number of factors we need to look at, and that's where climate predictions come in really handy. So you also need to define where you're going to undertake your planting. So this depends on your goal, the scale of the replanting, and also the questions you want to ask. Is it a single revegetation site and you're only interested in local questions? Are you trying to replant multiple sites? And do they have a different aridity gradient? And if so, are you going to choose species which are adapted to these local or regional scales? And are you going to do reciprocal planting? So by that we mean, are you going to use the same species and genetic material from one planting and use it in another planting in a different location? And if we want to facilitate gene flow between the areas that we're planting and nearby remnant vegetation, how is that going to work? How is the seed and pollen going to disperse? So that may be through water dispersal. So if you're planting next to a waterway, will that seed flow down and influence populations downstream? Are you planting close enough? So within 1 kilometre from current remnant area, so your seed and pollen is likely to disperse in that area. And also, how much cleared land is around, and is that likely to affect how your pollinators, such as birds and insects, travel to and from remnant and revegetated areas? And we're also looking at choosing the species that we replant in these areas. So although we want to originally base our revegetation on the local ecological vegetation classes, because we know these species are more likely to be adapted to that local area, we shouldn't always assume that these EVCs are going to remain the same in the future. As we said, the climate's going to be hotter and drier, so we may in fact lose some species, or entire EVCs may shift. So we need to consider how species and communities are likely to survive under a changing climatic condition. And we may want to choose species with a broad distribution, because this will help us obtain climate-adjusted seed easier for some of these species. So in the guidelines that were produced for Victoria, there were overall 100 species which were commonly used in revegetation, and we're just showing 10 here. And these are really widely distributed species. They may not all be likely found in the Melbourne Water area, but you can work with seed banks and local nurseries to try and work out what seed you're able to get from different regions, and if these species are going to be able to be planted in your local area. And there's going to be a bit of a bottleneck trying to get enough seed, especially climate provenance seed, for the species that you want to plant. So that's where seed production areas, producing your own climate adjusted seed, may be really important for the future. So how do we choose the provenances that we will use for revegetation? Well, we, as I said, need to take into account the availability of the seed for these provenances, and how will they contribute to successfully restoring a plant community, and will this plant community be resilient to a changing climate? And CSIRO have a really good website called Climate Change in Australia, which helps you choose where your local area is and look at your climate analogues, so what your local area will likely look like in the future. And that tells you where you're able to get, where you might be able to get seed from. So for example, if you're in Albury-Wodonga, you might want to look at getting seed from Dubbo, because it may look similar to Dubbo in 2050 or 2070. So seed from local sources may not be able to keep up with the rapid rate of a changing climate, and we need to try and pre-adapt our habitats to the future climate, as we've said before. So we're recommending a combination of what we're calling composite and climate adjusted provenancing when we're trying to select different seeds. So you can see on this graph that if we're looking at local adaptation, we're going to choose local provenances first. But if we also want to take into account genetic variability and how if these species are likely to adapt to a change in climate, we may need to start thinking about not only collecting seed from local communities, but also collecting seed from hotter and drier areas. And it's important to note that climate change isn't just one driver. There's a number of other drivers which influence plant survival and growth, such as soil condition, what the competition is, what the pest animals are in that region. So there's a number of other considerations, not just climate, that you need to take into account. But for a basic plot, we're suggesting you try and choose 4 or 5 provenances per species in case some fail to do well. And we're suggesting that you use local provenance, so about 60 to 70% of your seed should be from the local area. One provenance should be from wetter and cooler climates, and we're suggesting this because although generally we're expecting hotter and drier climates, some years might be really wet. So the science tells us that the best way to make sure that our plant community is robust to all these different changes and the huge amount of variability that we're likely to see in our climate is to try and buffer against those changes. So putting in wetter species as well as hot and dry species. So we're also saying try and include 2 to 3 provenances from hotter and drier areas. And if we're looking at that Climate Change in Australia website, we can say that in 2030, we want 10% of our seed coming from 2030 analogues, 10% from 2050, and 10% from 2070 or 2090 analogues. So we're really trying to make the areas that we're restoring more robust to a changing climate. And this is an example from Nardo Hills, where they were planting grey box, species of eucalypt, and they chose 5 different provenances. When one was local and the other 4 were based on different climate scenarios. And if we have strong concerns about the viability or genetic diversity of our local provenance, we probably need to think about increasing the proportions of our climate adjusted seed. So if you want to set up and lay out these type of plots, you need to think about the area that you're going to replant, how many species and how many different provenances you're going to put in. And there's a number of diagrams in the guide that's been produced for Victoria to help establish these climate adjusted plantings. And the things you need to consider are, as we say, the goals of the planting is really important, the number of species and provenances you're going to plant, if the site needs to be fenced off or the plant's guarded, the topography, what site preparation has been done, and if you're planning to water these plants, what the pests are in that local area and what weed management needs to be undertaken, and also consider what the previous land use has been. And you also need to think about who's going to manage this site, who's going to monitor the plantings, and how long is that going to go for. And generally we're thinking about 30-year timeframes for these type of plantings, because we really want to know how these areas are likely to change into the future, and even longer if we're going to be producing seed from it. And we're also going to think about surrounding landscape. So how are remnant areas likely to be influenced by these plantings that we're doing? And it's really important to try and establish a monitoring strategy as well as putting in these revegetation plots, because monitoring is vital, so it enables us to get a better understanding of the long-term impacts of plantings and how well they survive and grow and reproduce over time, and how much variation there is between seasons, years, and across species, provenances, and location. And ideally, it could also provide information on how animals are using these revegetated areas. So if we're looking at 4 species, so in this case, the stars, and as I said, we're looking at planting 60% local, 10% from the other climate analogues, we're likely to have a number of different plots that we need to sample. And this can be done using something like a 50 by 6 metre quadrant area and counting all the plants in that area every year to see how well they're surviving and growing. Again, there's a lot more detail in this in the Victorian guidelines if you're interested, and I'll put a link to that at the end of this presentation. And we really want to record the details for each provenance separately if we can, so we've got a much better idea about how different provenances adapt and change over time. So in summary, it's really important that we consider using climate adjusted seed to make our revegetated areas more resilient to a changing climate in the future. We need to identify where we get our seed from, and if we're going to be able to get enough seed, and if not, look at putting in things like seed production areas so we can maintain that seed and the quality of that seed going forward. And we really want to monitor these plantings to see how we can better adaptively manage our revegetation for the future. And there's been some work undertaken at the moment by the University of Melbourne in conjunction with Melbourne Water, looking at how different species are likely to be influenced by a changing climate. So doing species distribution modelling to see how up to 30 species are likely to be impacted by a changing climate. And ideally, we'd like to do more of that modelling in the future. So we've got a really good idea about how different species are likely to be influenced by hotter and drier conditions. There's also work being done by other universities, such as Edith Cowan, on the long-term outcomes of planting. And as I mentioned before, CSIRO, people like Linda Broadhurst and Susan Prober are doing a lot of field trials on different climate adjusted plantings. in conjunction with other groups. So ideally, we want to trial this knowledge, and we want to get a good idea about how the risks of climate change are going to impact our revegetated areas and how we can ameliorate these risks. And it'd be great to have a national or even state-based database so we can collate all of this information. And having an app or a web portal where it's really easy to enter this data on plant growth, reproduction and survival. And it's really important that we start talking to nurseries and seed banks to see what seed they have and how easy it's going to be to get climate adjusted seed into the future. So as I mentioned, all this work is based on robust science, and these are just some of the resources that are really good to have a look at. So especially the CSIRO Climate Change in Australia website is really good, especially if you're interested in looking at your climate analogues. Nola Hancock and the group from Macquarie Uni have also produced a guide on climate ready revegetation. And myself and Tanya Bailey have produced the climate future plots for Victoria guidelines, and they're available free off the website. You can see on the page. And as I mentioned before, Susan Prober and Linda Broadhurst from CSIRO have done a lot of have produced a lot of publications on this. So thanks very much, and please get in contact if you've got any questions. Thank you.